Welcome to my channel, the hidden drama where real-life stories unfold and every situation has a lesson. Some will surprise you, some will make you think, and some might feel closer to home than you expect. Now let's get into today's story. My aunt took me in as a child, then treated me like a servant for years. She made me drop out of school and work under her name. When I turned 25, I walked into her office wearing a suit with the paper that proved she was never the real owner of. I walked into Clara Velasco's office wearing a charcoal suit she had never seen me in before, the kind with sharp lines and expensive fabric that whispered success with every step. My shoes clicked against the polished marble floor, each echo bouncing off the walls of Velasco Logistics like a countdown to detonation. She sat behind that massive oak desk, the one I had polished on my hands and knees when I was 16, and she didn't even look up from whatever spreadsheet held her attention. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the keyboard with the same rhythm she had used to dismiss me for years, and I felt my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. This was it. This was the moment I had obsessed over, rehearsed in my mirror at 3 a.m, dreamed about while pretending to sleep in that tiny room she had given me that was really just a converted storage closet. I placed the folder on her desk, right on top of her precious papers, and watched her freeze. "You should knock before entering my office," she said without looking up, her voice carrying that sharp authority that used to make my stomach drop. But this time I didn't step back. This time I stood there and let the silence stretch until she finally looked up at me. Her eyes widened just a fraction when she saw the seal on the documents, that official stamp that meant lawyers and courts and things you couldn't just wave away with intimidation. "Who do you think you?" She stopped mid-sentence when she actually read the words. "Legal ownership transfer." My name typed out in official font. Lena Torres, rightful heir and owner of Velasco Logistics. For a moment the only sound in that massive office was the ticking of the wall clock, that same clock I had stared at during countless unpaid overtime hours while she was out at fancy dinners claiming my work as her own. I had spent most of my childhood believing I owed Clara everything, and that belief had poisoned me in ways I was only starting to understand. When my parents died in that accident, when the police officer came to my school and pulled me out of math class with that look on his face, Clara had swooped in like some kind of savior. She was my father's sister, the successful businesswoman who smelled like expensive perfume and wore power suits that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. She took me in, and for exactly 3 months she played the role of grieving guardian who was doing her best. Then the mask slipped. The private school became public school, became no school at all when she pulled me out at 16 to run errands, file paperwork, balance accounts, manage inventory, coordinate with suppliers, handle customer complaints, basically run her entire company while she took client meetings and smiled for cameras and accepted awards for business excellence. I was quiet back then, so quiet people forgot I was in the room, and maybe that was my biggest flaw. I never spoke up, I never fought back. I just absorbed every insult, every dismissal, every time she introduced me as her assistant instead of her niece, every time she took credit for systems I had designed, every time she cashed checks earned by my 70-hour work weeks. But being quiet meant I noticed things. I watched, I learned. I became obsessed with understanding every single aspect of that company, not because I loved the work, but because somewhere deep in my broken teenager brain I knew I would need that knowledge someday. Clara's lips curled into something between a smile and a snarl. "You stole something that doesn't belong to you," she said, her voice low and dangerous. I tilted my head slightly, that gesture I had learned from watching her manipulate board members. "No," I said calmly, surprised at how steady my voice sounded when inside I was shaking with rage and terror, and something that felt like vindication but tasted bitter. "I just found proof that it never belonged to you." She leaned back in her leather chair, the one that probably cost more than a semester of the college education she had stolen from me, and her eyes narrowed into slits. "You think a piece of paper scares me?" The laugh that came out of my mouth surprised even me. "That's not the only thing I brought." I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message. Within 30 seconds, the office door opened and Daniel Rivas walked in, my father's old attorney who was now 71 but still sharp as broken glass. Behind him came Mateo Cruz from operations, the only person in this building who had ever looked at me like I was human instead of furniture. And behind them came Iris Navarro, the financial auditor whose investigation I had quietly orchestrated over the past 6 months. Clara stood up so fast her chair rolled backward and hit the credenza. "What is this?" Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "This is the part where everything you built on lies comes crashing down," I said, and God help me, but I smiled when I said it. For years I had watched Clara build her reputation on a foundation of fraud and manipulation, and the truly sick part was how good she was at it. The company had never belonged to her. It had been my father's dream, his creation, the logistics business he had started in a rented warehouse with 2 employees and a prayer. After the accident, while I was still trying to figure out how to breathe without parents, Clara had quietly manipulated legal filings and forged signatures and exploited loopholes in estate law. I was 13. I didn't understand probate or corporate structures or how easy it was for an adult to steal everything from a grieving child, but Clara had overlooked one critical thing. The girl she treated like a servant, the one she forced to drop out of school and work 80-hour weeks without proper pay, that girl had been running the entire operation for years. I knew every client, every contract, every supplier relationship. I knew which accounts were profitable and which ones Clara kept for ego. I knew about the creative accounting and the expense reports that didn't quite add up and the way she billed clients for my work at executive rates while paying me minimum wage under the table. During those late nights balancing books in that converted closet she called my room, I had started collecting evidence. Old incorporation documents I found in archived boxes, email trails I had never deleted, notarized papers with signatures that didn't quite match. I reconnected with Daniel Rivers, who had suspected fraud for years but lacked proof and lacked a client willing to come forward. I spent 3 years building my case while pretending to be the same quiet, obedient girl Clara thought she had broken. But here is the truth about revenge that nobody tells you in the movies. It consumes you. It becomes the only thing that matters. I sacrificed everything for this moment. I had no friends because I spent every free hour gathering evidence. I pushed away the one guy who showed interest in me because I was too obsessed with takedown strategies to invest in a relationship. I stopped sleeping properly. I stopped eating properly. My entire identity became wrapped up in the fantasy of walking into this office and watching Clara's face crumble. Some nights I lay awake wondering if revenge was the only thing holding my damaged psyche together, if without this mission, I would just collapse into the broken little girl who never got to properly grieve her parents because she was too busy learning how to survive her aunt. My obsession made me ruthless in ways I didn't fully understand until later. I manipulated situations. I lied to people who trusted me. I used Mateo's loyalty without fully considering his feelings. I became so focused on the endgame that I stopped questioning whether the cost was too high. The opportunity finally came when Clara decided to sell the company. She had found some venture capital firm willing to pay $30 million for Velasco Logistics, and she was planning to take the money and retire to some villa in Spain. She had already started looking at properties. She had already started planning her exit from my life, probably assuming I would just fade away like I always had. But the sale required a full legal audit. The buyers wanted clean books and clear ownership chains and documentation for everything. That audit opened doors I had been trying to pry open for years. When Iris Navarro started digging into the corporate history, I made sure she found exactly what she needed to find. I dropped hints. I pointed her toward archived documents. I played the helpful longtime employee who just wanted everything to go smoothly. And slowly, carefully, the truth began to surface like a corpse rising from deep water. Now I stood in the office I had cleaned as a teenager, facing the woman who had stolen my childhood and my inheritance and nearly my sanity. Clara slammed the ownership documents shut so hard the sound echoed. "You think you can walk in here and take my life's work?" Her face was red now, that vein in her forehead throbbing the way it did when suppliers missed deadlines. I didn't sit down. I remained standing because sitting would have meant accepting some kind of subordinate position, and those days were over. "It wasn't your life's work," I said quietly. "You think you can just—" "I raised you," she shouted, and there it was, the defense she had probably been preparing since the moment she stole everything. "You raised me." My voice came out sharper than I intended, all that carefully controlled rage leaking through. "You used me. You pulled me out of school. You made me work 70-hour weeks. You paid me less than minimum wage while billing clients hundreds per hour for my work. You told everyone I was lucky to have you when you were the one stealing everything my father built. Your father was going to lose this company," Clara said, her voice dropping into something cruel. "He was drowning in debt. I saved it. I made it profitable. I turned it into something worth $30 million by using his daughter as free labor for a decade." The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Daniel Reavers stepped forward and placed another folder on the desk. "These are the original incorporation documents from 1998, he said in that calm lawyer voice that made everything sound inevitable. "Showing your brother as sole founder and owner. These are the estate documents showing Lena as sole heir. These are the fraudulent transfer documents you filed in 2014. And these are the financial records showing systematic wage theft and exploitation of a minor." Clara's face went from red to pale. "You can't prove. We already proved it," I interrupted. "The district attorney has copies, the Labour Board has copies, the IRS has copies." I pulled out my phone and showed her the email chain. "Your buyers have copies too. Funny thing about due diligence, it tends to uncover fraud. You reported me." Clara's voice was barely a whisper now. "No," I said, and I felt my hands shaking because this was it. This was the moment I had been building toward for years, and now that it was here I felt strange and hollow, and not at all like I had imagined. The investors did. Once they saw the ownership records and realized they were buying a company from someone who didn't legally own it, they started asking questions. Turns out institutional investors don't like fraud. The next few hours happened in a blur of legal terminology and frozen bank accounts and phone calls to lawyers who couldn't fix what was fundamentally broken. Clara tried everything. She threatened, she pleaded, she claimed I had manipulated documents, she claimed Daniel was senile, she claimed Matteo and I were having an affair and this was all some conspiracy. She went through every stage of denial like someone drowning, grabbing at anything that might save her. But the evidence was overwhelming. Decades of financial manipulation laid out in spreadsheets and bank records and testimony from employees who had watched her exploit me. By evening, Clara was being escorted out of the building she had ruled for 20 years. Security guards flanked her, not because she was dangerous but because protocol required it. Employees gathered in the hallways, watching silently as she passed. Some of them had known the truth for years. Others were just learning it. Not one person stopped her. Not one person defended her. And not one person stopped me as I stood there watching, my arms crossed, my face carefully neutral even though inside I was screaming. 2 days later I sat in that office alone, the one that legally belonged to me now according to multiple court documents and ownership transfers. The victory felt quiet, almost empty. I had imagined this moment would feel like triumph, like justice, like finally being able to breathe after years underwater. Instead it felt like standing in ruins, surveying damage that couldn't be undone. I stared out the window at the city spread below, all those lights in all those buildings full of people living their lives, and I wondered who I might have become if revenge hadn't consumed 10 years of my existence. Would I have gone to college like my father wanted? Would I have friends who knew me as something other than the driven, obsessed woman who talked about nothing but legal strategies and document trails? Would I have learned how to be happy instead of just learning how to plan someone's downfall? My phone buzzed against the desk, making me jump. A message from Daniel. "There's one more thing you should know about the original ownership documents." I frowned and opened the attachment he sent. Another file, this one older than the others, the scan quality poor like it had been copied from actual paper instead of digital records. My father had transferred partial control of the company months before his death. Not to Clara, not to me because I was only 12 then and couldn't legally own a business, but to someone else entirely. I read the name 3 times before it registered. Marcus Chen. I didn't know anyone by that name. My father had never mentioned anyone by that name. I scrolled through the document with shaking hands, my obsessive mind already trying to fit this new information into everything I thought I understood. According to the paperwork, my father had transferred 40% ownership to someone named Marcus Chen in January 2014, just 2 months before the accident. The transfer included language about mentorship and succession planning and protecting the company's future. There was a clause about Chen taking full control if anything happened to my father before I reached 25. And according to the records, according to the footnotes Daniel had added to the file, Marcus Chen had just filed a claim to reclaim his 40% ownership. The claim had been submitted to the court yesterday, with legal representation from a firm I didn't recognize. The filing argued that Clara's fraud had illegally diluted his ownership stake, and that the recent ownership transfer to me didn't properly account for his existing claim. I sat there in the dim office, the city lights blurring through unexpected tears, and realized my revenge might have just opened a door I couldn't close. I called Daniel immediately. "Who is Marcus Chen?" My voice came out harsh. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I only found the filing this morning, but Lena, if this claim is legitimate, if it's legitimate then I don't fully own the company I just destroyed my aunt's life to reclaim." The words tasted like ash. We need to investigate his claim. He could be fraudulent too. He could be someone Clara paid off to complicate things. He could be exactly who he says he is, I interrupted. He could be someone my father trusted with his company, someone my father chose. The implications crashed over me like cold water, all my careful planning, all my evidence gathering, all my righteous anger about Clara stealing what belonged to me. What if I didn't understand the full story? What if my father had been preparing to transition the company to someone else anyway? What if my revenge had been built on incomplete information filtered through the traumatized perspective of a 13-year-old who never got proper answers? We'll handle this, Daniel said in that calm voice. We'll verify the documents. We'll contact Chen's representatives. I need to see those original documents, I said. Everything from 2014, everything my father signed in the months before he died. Lena, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that I ruined Clara's life based on incomplete information, that my obsession made me tunnel-visioned, that I was so focused on revenge I didn't bother to understand the full context. My voice was rising now, that control I had maintained for years finally cracking. That's exactly what I need to prepare for. I spent the next week drowning in documents that felt like they were written in a foreign language my grief brain couldn't translate. My father's business records from 2014 painted a picture I had never known. The company had been struggling. Clara was right about that, though it killed me to admit it. Revenue was down. Major clients were leaving. Operational costs were eating profit margins. My father had been desperate to save his creation, and he had reached out to Marcus Chen, apparently a logistics industry consultant who specialized in turning around failing companies. The mentorship agreement was detailed and specific. Chen would invest capital, provide strategic guidance, and help restructure operations in exchange for 40% ownership. If the turnaround succeeded, he would gradually sell his stake back to our family. If my father died or became incapacitated before I turned 25, Chen would assume controlling interest until I was old enough to take over properly. It was a protection mechanism, a way to keep the company out of Clara's hands while ensuring I would inherit something stable instead of something drowning. My father had seen Clara's opportunistic nature even back then. He had tried to protect me. And then he died, and Clara had apparently hidden or destroyed any documents that mentioned Chen's involvement, and I had spent 10 years believing a story that was only partially true. The meeting with Marcus Chen happened on a Thursday morning in a conference room that felt too small for the weight of what we needed to discuss. He was 53 years old, Korean-American, with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he had spent as many sleepless nights over this situation as I had. His lawyer sat next to him, a sharp woman in her 40s who watched me like I might explode. Daniel sat next to me, his hand occasionally touching my arm when he sensed I was about to say something I would regret. Your father was a good man, Chen said quietly. Those were his first words to me, and I hated how they made my throat tighten. He loved you very much. He talked about you constantly. If he loved me so much, why did I have to find out about you from legal documents? The anger in my voice was a defense mechanism against the grief trying to surface. Why didn't you come forward after he died? Why did you let Clara steal everything? I tried, Chen said, and something in his voice made me believe him. I filed claims with the court. I contacted lawyers, but Clara had money and connections and a sympathetic story about taking in her orphaned niece. My claims got buried in legal red tape. Eventually my lawyer advised me to wait until you turned 25, until you could legally contest things yourself, until the situation was less about a strange man trying to take a company from a grieving widow and more about, Clara wasn't his widow, I snapped. She was his sister, and she stole from both of us. I know, Chen said simply. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to stop her. I'm sorry you went through what you went through. But Lena, your father's last conversation with me was about making sure you were protected. He knew Clara would try to take control. The ownership structure we created was specifically designed to prevent that. He wanted you to inherit a healthy company when you were old enough to run it properly, not a struggling mess or nothing at all because Clara had destroyed it. So what happens now? I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. Do you take everything? Do I lose it all anyway? No, Chen said firmly. What happens now is we honor what your father wanted. I have no interest in running this company long term. I'm 53, I want to retire. But I do want my investment back and I want to ensure the company is stable before I exit, so here's what I propose. He slid a document across the table. A partnership agreement. He would maintain his 40% ownership for 5 years while I learned to truly run the company, not just manage operations but handle strategy and growth, and all the things I had never been allowed to learn. He would mentor me the way he had intended to mentor my father. After 5 years, I could buy out his stake at a fair market price, or we could negotiate a different arrangement based on how things developed. Why would you do this? I asked suspiciously, my obsessive mind searching for the trap. Because your father trusted me to protect his daughter and his legacy, and I failed at that for 10 years, Chen said. I can't give you back your childhood, I can't undo what Clara did, but I can help you become the businesswoman your father believed you could be. The next few months were brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Running a company with legitimate authority was completely different from running it as Clara's invisible servant. I had to learn leadership. I had to learn how to manage people who respected me instead of people who dismissed me. I had to learn how to make strategic decisions instead of just executing someone else's plans. I had to learn how to accept help instead of assuming everyone was trying to exploit me. Chen was patient in ways I didn't deserve. My obsessive tendencies made me difficult to work with. I micromanaged everything because letting go of control felt like drowning. I snapped at people when they questioned my decisions because years of being dismissed had made me defensive. I worked 18-hour days because rest felt like weakness. You're going to burn out, Matteo told me one evening when he found me in the office at 9, reviewing contracts that could have waited. I'm fine, I lied. No, you're not. You're doing the same thing Clara did. You're letting this company consume you. You're sacrificing everything else for success. That's different. She was stealing. You're destroying yourself, he interrupted gently. And your father wouldn't have wanted that. Neither does Chen. Neither do I wanted to argue. I wanted to defend my work ethic and my commitment and my determination to prove I deserved this. But instead, I just put my head down on the desk and cried for the first time since walking into Clara's office in that charcoal suit. Therapy helped. I didn't want to go, but Chen made it a condition of our partnership agreement, and eventually I admitted I needed it. I talked about my parents' death and the grief I had never processed. I talked about Clara's abuse and how it had shaped my belief that my worth was measured by productivity. I talked about my obsession with revenge and how it had become my entire identity. I talked about the guilt of discovering my revenge had been based on incomplete information, that Chen was a victim too, that maybe the world was more complicated than the simple victim versus villain narrative I had constructed. Do you regret what you did to Clara? My therapist asked during one session. I thought about it for a long time. No, I finally said. What she did was wrong, regardless of the Marcus Chen situation. She abused me. She exploited me. She stole years of my life. The fact that she wasn't the only villain in this story doesn't make her less guilty. But I regret how consuming the revenge became. I regret letting it define me. I regret sacrificing relationships and health and any chance at normal happiness because I was so focused on that one moment of confrontation. The revenge itself was justified. The obsession was not. Clara's criminal trial happened 8 months after I walked into her office. She was charged with fraud, embezzlement, labor law violations, and exploitation of a minor. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution called me to testify, and I sat in that witness box and detailed every way she had used me, and I watched her face remain cold and impassive, like even now she couldn't admit what she had done. She was convicted on most charges and sentenced to 4 years in prison plus restitution. The judge's statement included language about the breach of familial trust and the exploitation of a vulnerable child, and I felt nothing when the sentence was read. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a deep, weary sense that justice had been served, but justice couldn't give me back what I had lost. After the trial, I visited her once before she was transferred to federal prison. I don't know why I went. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I needed to see her one final time as a person instead of a villain. What do you want? She asked when the guard brought her to the visitors' area. She looked older, grayer, smaller somehow. I don't know, I admitted honestly. Maybe I wanted to understand why you did it. I saved that company, she said, her voice still defiant. Your father was going to lose everything. I stepped in. I made it profitable. I built it into something valuable. By stealing from me, I said quietly. You could have done all of that and still treated me like family. You could have put me through school, you could have paid me fairly, you could have acknowledged my work, you chose not to. I gave you a home. You gave me a prison. We sat there in silence for a while, 2 people who had once been family staring at each other across a visiting room table. Do you hate me? She finally asked, and for the first time she sounded uncertain. No, I said, surprising myself. I'm angry at what you did. I'm angry at the years you stole, but hate takes energy I don't have anymore. I just want to move forward. With Marcus Chen, her voice was bitter. With whoever helps me build something worth building, I said. I stood to leave and she called my name one last time. Your father would have been proud of you, she said, for taking the company back. No, I said softly. He would have been proud if I had learned to value myself as more than just the company. That's what I'm working on now. 2 years later, I bought out Chen's ownership stake for $12 million, financed through a combination of company profits and a business loan. He stayed on as a consultant for another year after that, helping me navigate expansion into new markets. The company thrived in ways I never imagined during those years of running it from the shadows. We doubled our client base. We won industry awards. We were featured in business magazines as a turnaround success story, though none of the articles mentioned the full truth of what had happened. I learned to work reasonable hours. I learned to delegate. I learned to build relationships that weren't based on utility or strategy. I started dating someone I met at a logistics conference, a relationship that moved slowly and carefully because I was still learning how to trust people with the softer parts of myself. I reconciled with some extended family members who had been caught in the middle of everything with Clara. I started a scholarship fund for children who had lost parents, using my own story to help others avoid being exploited in their grief. But here's the thing about revenge that nobody tells you in the movies. It doesn't fix you. Standing in Clara's office, watching her empire collapse, seeing the fear in her eyes as she realized she had lost everything. That moment was satisfying in the way cutting open an infection is satisfying, necessary, important, but not healing in itself. The healing came later, in therapy and relationships, and slowly building a life that was about more than just proving I deserved to exist. The revenge was the end of one story. Everything after was the beginning of a different one, and that story was harder and slower and less dramatic, but ultimately more meaningful. I still think about that day sometimes, walking into her office in that charcoal suit with those documents that proved she had stolen everything. I still remember the look on her face when she realized she had underestimated the quiet girl she had exploited for so long. And I still believe what I did was necessary and just, but I also know now that revenge was only ever going to be one moment, and I had to learn how to build a life out of all the moments that came after. The company is successful. I am successful. I have meaningful relationships and a sense of purpose that extends beyond just work. And Clara is serving her sentence, and somewhere in that prison I hope she is learning the same lesson I learned. That revenge might be justified, but it is not the same thing as healing, and healing is what actually matters in the end. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next story.